So with the massive overhauls coming to Season 4 of Diablo 4, I've been seeing a lot of people ask the question of should they come back to Diablo 4 for Season 4? So in this video, I want to go over the answer to that question. And I think the best place to start, and the thing that's going to have the largest impact on removing negative elements from Diablo 4, is going to be the massive itemization changes. And I think one of the most criticized parts of itemization for Diablo 4 has been the massive amount of time it takes to sift through all of the junk items you get while playing. You would commonly go out, do a nightmare dungeon, and completely fill up your inventory or even more in one nightmare dungeon, and 99% or more of all the items you're getting are complete junk, and it just takes way too long to compare these items and to find a good item. And this is one of the biggest criticisms being targeted with these itemization changes. Starting off with just removing a ton of the more boring or more complicated affixes, most notably being the removal of most of the conditional affixes, commonly talked about as damage on Tuesday, where you would need some conditional on top of a conditional to get, say, a damage buff. Pretty much all of those affixes have been removed, massively reducing the amount of affixes you have to compare, and these affixes would just convolute how easy it was to tell the power of different affixes compared to each other. And another pretty big change is reducing the amount of affixes on items. So now rare items are going to go from 4 to 2 affixes, and legendary items are going to go from 4 to 3 total affixes. And to add on top of that, all affixes are now going to be much stronger. Before, you would get a legendary item, it would have 4 affixes, a ton of conditionals, and none of those affixes would actually be very strong. You wouldn't notice getting a new damage increase from a specific affix. But now at max, you'll get a legendary item with 3 affixes, all of those affixes being much more simple, pretty much no conditional affixes, and they're all going to be much stronger. So when you get an item with, say, a big damage increase affix, you're going to be able to tell the difference of actually getting that affix upgrade. It's going to be much more noticeable, and all of these changes have the very good side effect of making items much more simple to sift through. And on top of all of this, you're going to be getting a lot less item drops. So instead of going and doing a nightmare dungeon and fully filling up your inventory and possibly even getting more than a full inventory of loot, now you'll do a nightmare dungeon and you'll only have a handful of items. You'll be able to do quite a lot of nightmare dungeons before your inventory is completely filled. But because of all of these other changes, meaning there's a lot less useless affixes, meaning they're much more easy to sift through, and affixes being much stronger, a lot more of those items are actually going to be usable or good or even best in slot. So you're just going to be getting a lot less junk items, meaning you're able to sift through gear much more easily, meaning you're able to actually play the game a lot more, and you're going to spend less time sitting in town sifting through dozens of junk items. So if spending too much time having to sift through a bunch of junk items was one of the reasons you stopped playing Diablo 4, I would definitely recommend checking out Season 4. This is one of the main elements targeted by these itemization changes. Now, another pretty big criticism of the itemization of Diablo 4 was that once you got a decent item or got an item you wanted to use, you couldn't really do anything to it. All you were able to do was go and roll one of those affixes. That's all you could do. You had almost no control over an item past what it dropped as. But with Season 4, you're going to have quite a lot of control over pretty much any item you actually want to use. Getting an item in Diablo 4 now is going to be the start of that item's journey. And kind of the start of that is re-rolling the one affix, the enchanting system, which is still part of the itemization. So you choose one affix and you can roll that as many times as you want. A big quality of life change is that re-rolling those affixes now has a cap to how much it costs. So you get to a certain point and the gold cost will not continue to increase like it could before. Before Season 4, the gold cost infinitely increased. Now it's at a decently low cap. So you'll be able to get the affix roll you want from enchanting a lot easier, and you'll pretty much be able to guarantee you get the one you're actually looking for. But we're also getting 2 additional crafting systems that massively overhauls the journey an item can take and gives you, the player, much more control over your items. First off being the tempering system. This is a new system that will allow you to add much more interesting affixes to your items. Any content you do throughout the game will give you these tempering manuals, which are permanent recipes. They have 3 to 5 affixes on them, and you go to the tempering system, and every one of your ancestral items you'll add 2 additional affixes to. A lot of these affixes in the tempering system being the most interesting affixes, such as multicast, increasing the radius of effects, giving you massive amounts of resources back, giving you massive damage or cooldown reduction to specific skills. Pretty much all of the most interesting affixes you could think of to be in an ARPG is through the tempering system. And you also have a certain amount of rerolls in the system, so you have a decent chance of getting an affix that's good for your build to make that item very good. And then the second new crafting system kind of adds on top of all of these other elements. This is called masterworking. This is replacing the upgrade system that we have in Diablo 4 prior to Season 4. So instead of now you just upgrade an item 5 times, you get some additional stats and that's it. Now we have the masterworking system. It has 12 upgrades. These upgrades are split into 3 different sections. You upgrade an item 3 times. Every one of those upgrades increases all of the affixes on that item by 5%. The 4th upgrade of that section increases the power of one affix by 25%. And every one of these sections does that same thing. So now you'll be massively increasing the affixes on your items, and you have this random roll elements for one of your affixes to get a massive stat bump on the 4th upgrade of those 3 sections, and those massive increases of 25% on a singular affix can all go on the same affix. So you could potentially get those 3 big upgrades on a singular affix, increasing its roll by 75% just from those 3 upgrades. So this masterworking system is basically the finishing element of getting a gear drop, re-rolling one of the affixes to what you want, adding 2 new affixes through the tempering system, and then upgrading it with the masterworking system. This is going to be a journey every one of your items is going to take, giving you the most amount of control on an item that you have ever had in any Diablo game. So if you stopped playing Diablo 4 because you had minimal control over items and there was basically no crafting systems in the game, Season 4 is definitely going to be a complete overhaul going in the direction you would probably want. Now, a pretty important element of ARPGs as a whole is the excitement of getting best in slot rolled items or getting super rare drops. That excitement of getting that one drop you've been looking for has always been one of the biggest driving factors of games like this. And Season 4 is also targeting this element to just make the game much more exciting. Because prior to Season 4, Diablo 4 was pretty much void of this element. The only really exciting thing would be getting, say, an uber unique. But now with Season 4, you're going to have a handful of different things that makes a game much more exciting. First off, being one of the big changes to itemization being greater affixes. Now, greater affixes are going to be just a very juiced up version of affixes on any ancestral item drops. This includes legendary items, rare items, and unique items. Now, greater affixes are going to be a 1.5 times multiplier on the affix of that item, and it's always going to be the max roll. So let's say you had a legendary item that has an intelligence roll that can roll 50 to 100. And let's say that item drops with a greater affix roll. Now that item would be able to roll up to 150 intelligence, but because it's a greater affix, it would always roll at 150 intelligence. And every affix on an item can be a greater affix. And like I mentioned, greater affixes can be on unique items. So you could potentially find a unique item for greater affix rolls, meaning every one of the affixes now was multiplied by 1.5 times, making any item getting greater affixes absurdly strong compared to items that don't have them. And likewise, this means once you get super late into the end game of Diablo 4, this is also going to play into not having to sift through so many items, and it's going to be a pseudo loot filter. Because let's say you're level 100, you're pretty well geared, you're now not going to care about any items besides items dropping with greater affixes. They're just so much stronger that anything without greater affixes is going to be complete junk, but this is a good thing once you're that late into the end game, because now you don't have to sift through so many items. Now this is working as a sort of loot filter, because any item without a greater affix you know is just junk and just another item to salvage for more resources. And this is just going to add a massive amount of excitement, because it may be a little bit exciting to get, say, an item with one greater affix on, say, a stat you may need, but you could also get, say, a legendary item with all 3 of the stats you need, all as greater affixes. So now this item is just 50% or more better than the item you're currently wearing acquiring, and that's before you get into any of the crafting elements. Because even though greater affixes are only something you can get through dropped items, you can still go, say, masterwork an item and keep increasing those greater affixes through that system, and you could potentially get a greater affix roll on an item, which is a 1.5 times multiplier. You could go to the masterworking system, go through all the upgrades, and you could potentially get all 3 of the 25% big upgrades on that greater affix, just giving you the possibility of getting one stat that's like 200% higher than you could possibly get it prior to Season 4. But that's just on the itemization side. Another very important thing of a lot of ARPGs is resources. And in Diablo 4, we have a handful of more rare resources that are using all the crafting recipes. We have all these different resources for crafting elixirs and incenses. And then we also have the summoning materials to be able to go face the endgame bosses to target farm unique items. All of these different resources are very important. And in Season 4, you'll have the potential to get a lot more of them in a lot more exciting ways. One of the biggest changes being that any elite in the game now has a low chance to just explode in loot of any one of these resources. Maybe this rare could explode into a bunch of herbs, you can craft a bunch of elixirs. Maybe this one could explode into a bunch of ore that you can go use in all the new crafting systems, or even a rare could explode into a bunch of boss summoning materials. So maybe you kill an elite and it drops a bunch of materials to go face Duriel to go target farm uber uniques. So just killing any rare in the game is going to be much more exciting than it was previously. This also extends to loot goblins, because loot goblins are also going to have this chance to just drop any other resources in the game, and loot goblins seem to have a much higher chance to do this. So just going out, killing elites, finding loot goblins, you're going to just be getting tons of rare materials and tons of boss summoning mats, which again is just going to make any gameplay in Diablo 4 more exciting because of the possibility of just getting a big loot explosion. So if one of the reasons you stopped playing Diablo 4 was because the loot drops just weren't exciting enough, I think Season 4 is going to have you covered, and it's going to be much more exciting to just play the game and get loot. Now, I think the final factor we have to look at is endgame content, because in ARPGs especially, endgame content is king. The more endgame content you have, the more options you have, the longer people are going to play the game, and generally the more satisfied people are going to be with their game time. And these overhauls coming to Season 4 is going to be adding quite a lot of new endgame content. Now, also keep in mind that everything in this video we've gone over, including this new endgame content, is not the seasonal theme for Diablo 4. This is all permanent additions or overhauls to the game, including all of this new endgame content. All of this stuff is going to be added to all of future seasons and the Eternal Realms. We still don't have any information on this seasonal theme for Diablo 4, so we're still going to be getting a ton of new content and systems past what we're going over in this video. Now, the first bit of this new endgame content is probably the most exciting addition that's ever been added to Diablo 4, which is called the Pit. Now, the Pit is basically greater riffs from Diablo 3. I think they're actually a little bit better, but this is a new endgame system you have to complete a level 46 Nightmare Dungeon to even get into, where you have to spend a small amount of this new resource that you can get anywhere in the game to enter one of these pits. And once you get in this pit, you have 10 minutes to just kill enemies as quickly as possible to fill up a bar. Once that bar is filled, a boss portal will spawn. You go in, you defeat the boss. If you defeat that boss within the allotted time, you'll get a bunch of resources that you use in the new masterwork and crafting system we went over, and then you'll also just get a bunch of loot drops from the bosses themselves. And while doing runs of this pit, no items drop from any enemies you're killing until you defeat the boss at the end. So this is one of the first times in Diablo 4 where you don't have to worry about slowing down to pick up loot. You don't have to worry about doing other small objectives like releasing prisoners or bringing an item back to a pedestal. Only thing you are doing in these pit runs is killing big groups of enemies. They seem to have pretty good density. You're just trying to kill as many monsters as you possibly can as quickly as you possibly can. And that may sound like a simplistic system, but I think this is where ARPGs, and especially an ARPG with combat as good as Diablo 4, I think this is where these games shine. Just blasting through as many monsters as you possibly can, then defeating a boss at the end. It's simple, but I think it's absolutely the best endgame content in Diablo 4. And as mentioned, this is where you get the masterwork materials to upgrade your gear in Season 4 and onward. So you're getting getting tons of rewards for doing this. The gameplay is incredible, probably the best in any endgame system, and the system is almost infinitely scaling. It has hundreds of levels to go through, and the enemies start at level 100 at level 1. So with the higher ends, you'll be able to face like level 200 or more enemies, super difficult, and this will also be a system where you'll be able to test your strongest build against. Because it has so many levels, at some point you're probably not going to be able to go higher, but this gives you a massive incentive to keep trying to make your build stronger and make the strongest builds possible, because you'll actually have difficult endgame content for those builds to test themselves against. Well, that's not all coming to the endgame for Season 4 and onward, because we're also getting a massive Helltide overhaul, and if you played Season 2 of Diablo 4, this is basically adding in all of the open world elements of Season 2 into Helltides. So now you have a new currency that allows you to summon a massive zone-wide boss where all other players can come in and take part in this boss fight against what seems to be a very difficult boss right now that almost seems to have as much health as world bosses. Then there's going to be massively increased density. There's going to be random elements constantly spawning, such as these big hellworms popping up and spewing out just dozens of elites at you. And one of the most exciting elements of these new refreshed Helltides is the threat meter, which is kind of like what levels in GTA. You have this bar that you fill up by killing enemies, and once that bar is filled, massive groups of elites and other enemies will spawn in on you and start attacking you. As you kill those enemies, you drain the meter. As the meter's fully drained, a mini boss Hellborn will spawn in that's a pretty difficult mini boss, and you can kill that for a bunch of loot as well. So Helltides have been pretty much overhauled into an actually interesting and fun endgame system that's much more rewarding, much more difficult, just has massively increased density that's just going to allow you to go in there and destroy hordes of demons. And the final piece is a massive addition to the endgame boss ladder. So right now we have the handful of endgame bosses that range from like level 70 all the way up to level 100 with Duriel. And those bosses are all generally pretty easy. Duriel is a bit difficult, but once you get to 100, he's pretty easy. But now we're getting massive additions to change it. First off, we're getting a new boss that's a counterpart to Duriel, being Andariel, and she shares the same loot tables as Duriel, so another boss to target farm uber uniques, but we're also getting uber versions of every endgame boss in the boss ladder, specifically level 200 versions of all of these endgame bosses. And these level 200 versions are very difficult, even for the strongest builds in the PTR, and even builds that are using blatantly broken elements. These bosses are still pretty difficult. They have a ridiculous amount of health, they deal more damage to you, but they're going to give you an absurd amount of loot. They're going to give you tons of legendaries, they're going to give you a handful of uniques, and these are going to be the best way to target farm any uniques you want and any uber uniques. But you are going to need a good amount of materials to fight these. You're going to need a new material from the pit called Stygian Stones. Once you defeat the boss itself will drop these Stygian Stones. Then you're going to need even more of the boss summoning materials you need for the normal versions of these bosses. But as mentioned, these level 200 uber bosses are going to drop a ridiculous amount of loot. So likewise with the pit, this is another endgame addition to the game that's permanent to Diablo 4, that's going to give you another endgame element that's difficult, that you can test your builds against, that's also just going to be much more rewarding than a lot of the other elements in Diablo 4. Just giving new endgame content that's actually difficult, that gives you a reason to make incredibly strong builds. So if you stop playing Diablo 4 because of a lack of endgame content, Season 4 and onward is definitely going to be going in the direction you want. So I think this has been a lot of the main elements we're getting with the massive overhauls coming with Season 4, and I think these are a lot of the main elements that have been pain points for Diablo 4 previous to Season 4 that have caused a lot of people to stop playing or take breaks or just to not want to continue playing Diablo 4. And I think if any of these pieces of the game is a reason you stop playing, I think Diablo 4 is a great time to come back to the game. These are massive overhauls to the game. They're completely reworking a lot of the fundamental systems, and a lot of these are direct responses to player feedback. And again, these are just the permanent additions coming with Season 4 that are also going to be on the Eternal Realms. We still don't even know the Season 4 theme, and all the themes for seasons add in new endgame content, add in new bosses, add in new items. They always add in new systems that give us more power and more ways to customize. So in my personal opinion, Season 4 is the perfect time to come back to Diablo 4. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.